Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk About the Middle East. I'm Andy Blanche.
And I'm Juliana Musheyev, and John Dickman is here today helping us with the show.
On this show, we talk about the Middle East, its culture, politics, religion, history, just about anything that captures the complexity of the region.
We hope to promote open and honest discussion about the conflict in Israel and Palestine, and to humanize the conflict by getting to know people who have a stake in the issues. Today we'll be interviewing Brittany Victoria Gonzalez. Brittany is a writer and former humanitarian aid worker with a decade of experience in refugee and migration issues. She has lived in multiple countries throughout the Middle East and Africa, with the majority of her time overseas spent in Egypt and Kenya. In 2010 to 2011, she witnessed the build-up to the Egyptian Revolution and its subsequent aftermath. Thank you so much for joining us, Brittany.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
You were a caseworker with the UN-funded Resettlement Legal Aid Project, working every day with refugees. In the United States, we have been criticized for not taking in more refugees from Syria, Iraq, and Libya. Obama has pledged to resettle 10,000 refugees in 2016, but has only resettled 1,300 so far. Do you think that the U.S. should be resettling more refugees?
Absolutely. The reality is this is one of the biggest refugee crises we've had since World War II. And to break down the numbers, there are 60 million refugees or internally displaced people in the world right now. 0.1% of those will ever be resettled to a safe country. And that's an appalling number. That's shocking. These are people who will either be returned to war, where they face death, starvation, disease, a country that has been decimated, or they'll spend their lives in camps. And we have the resources and the ability to be taking in more. There's a great deal of fear that exists within both the American population and the American government right now regarding refugees, how they're vetted, where they're coming from. There are concerns that they're coming from countries where ISIL is currently operating, and those concerns are valid, but not based on fact and information. And the reality is refugees go through a very heavy vetting process to even be considered for resettlement, let alone actually be resettled. They first have to flee their countries and get to a country where they can stay legally. In this case, I was working in Egypt with refugees, and so we would have people coming from countries like Iraq, which is producing a lot of refugees now. And they come to an organization like the Resettlement Legal Aid Project, where we review their cases, determine whether they even have a case. I think there's this idea that refugees mean anyone who has fled their home, and that's not what the term means. Refugee is a specific type of person who has fled, who meets the UN's requirements to be a refugee under the 51 Convention. So they have to have fled based on persecution of race, religion, nationality, social group, political views, and on top of that, they have to be unable to appeal to the protection of the state, which generally, if you're already being persecuted, you probably can't. But there are many people who are denied refugee status despite being able to prove these claims. So once they are given refugee status or can prove it, an organization like mine would write up their testimonies, submit them to the UN for review. And from there, if they're accepted, they go through a vetting process, security details and medical details done by Department of Homeland Security, Department of Defense, intelligence agencies, the UN security agencies. There's several major intelligence agencies go through this vetting process, and every single detail that they provide is scrutinized down to the tiniest detail. Friends, family members are called to verify their stories. Organizations who may have been in the area during a bombing or an attack will verify whether it actually happened, whether the dates are right. And I've had clients who had compelling, horrible stories turned away for things like not crying while recounting torture. And so the interviewer assumed they were lying, or saying they were tortured or bombed at night when it actually happened in the morning. Total disregard for the fact that trauma alters memory. So to think that aid workers feel that we're not letting in enough and that we're vetting them too heavily, because people who deserve to be living free from persecution and outside of a refugee camp are denied that right by the hundreds of thousands every day. And it's heartbreaking. And I think if more people really understood how much work went into this vetting process, with countries like Syria, where there are several different terrorist factions operating, it takes at least 4 years to be approved for resettlement status. Usually the average is about 2 years. And there's clauses that prevent, would-be persecutors from being granted resettlement status, which makes sense until you realize that a lot of would-be persecutors are people like child soldiers who had no say in the matter. And now, because of bad luck, will never have the opportunity to live a life safe and free. So, to summarize, yes, we need to be taking in more, and people need to understand that nobody wants someone to fall through the cracks. Nobody wants an attack on American soil, especially not organizations or departments like the Department of Defense. And refugees are vetted so heavily through so many different layers that it would be almost impossible for one to sneak in with ill intent, particularly because you can't even decide which country you want to be resettled to. All of that is determined by the UN and the various countries' Homeland Security departments. So it's an understandable fear, but also an irrational one when you look at the facts.
Can you explain what kinds of things you encountered in your work? What kinds of conditions do these people face in the refugee camps once they get there?
It's sad and it's horrific. In Egypt, I was working primarily with urban refugees because there are no camps in Egypt. There are detention centers in some areas, but for the most part, they flee to Egypt. Egypt offers refugees the right to stay in Egypt, but they can't have access to any social services. They can't go to school. So it's not really a life. You can't succeed like that. On top of that, I had a lot of refugees. My clients were primarily from Iraq and then Sudan, Somalia, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Black Africans face heavy persecution in North African countries and in Arab countries, and it's a sad reality. So on top of having already fled brutal persecution, they're now facing it again in the country they sought refuge in. They face police brutality, mass arrests, unlawful detentions, just daily harassment on the streets, murder, rape. And so it's essentially seeking freedom and instead getting the same thing from another country, the same level of persecution. And there's no hope for most of them, and that's the sad reality, is many will be resettled, but most won't. And often the ones who won't be resettled are the people who need it most. They're the people who came from a very poor village in Ethiopia versus, a wealthy doctor from Iraq. And it's not that one story is worse than the other. It's that it's sad that we determine a human's worth based on skill and wealth and not who they are and what they deserve as a human being.
So you spent a number of years working with refugees in Kenya, and recently Kenya's government announced that it will be closing Dadaab. Am I pronouncing that right? Dadaab, the largest refugee camp in the world in northeast Kenya. What kind of effect do you think this will have on the refugees living there?
It will have a disastrous effect. Kenya's threatened this before. This is the closest they've come to following through. I really hope they don't, but they seem serious about it. There's a lot of discontent between the people of Kenya, Kenyan government, and Somali refugees. They blame them for a lot of the internal struggles going on in Kenya. Essentially, this is a camp full of anywhere from 300 to 600,000 people who are all, according to the Kenyan government, they will be forced to go back to Somalia where there is still ongoing conflict. It's a direct violation of the non-refoulement portion of international law, which says it's illegal to send a human being back to a place where we know they will be persecuted and we know they face death. So they're violating international law, and they're going to be sending hundreds of thousands of people to, at best, lengthy jail sentences and torture, and worst case, death. It's horrific.
Do you know what the reason behind their threatening to close the camp?
There have been terrorist attacks in Kenya. Most notably, there was the attack on Westgate Mall that was perpetrated by Somalis in 2013. And they have repeatedly blamed Somali refugees for violence, for attacks, for bombings that have occurred over the years. And they also use them as the scapegoat for crime. And there's a very lengthy, involved history in Kenya regarding the treatment of Somali people. And we could do a whole interview on that. But
this is Let's Talk About the Middle East.
Let's talk about the Middle East. So, in short, it is another extreme form of persecution that the Kenyan government is perpetrating against Somalis.
So let's talk about Egypt. In late 2010, a revolutionary wave of protest, demonstrations, riots, and civil wars sprang up in the Arab world, beginning in Tunisia and spreading to Egypt, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Bahrain, as well as other countries. You were in Egypt at the time when the buildup was happening before the revolution. In your view, what were the conditions that led to the uprising there?
Egypt had been under Mubarak's rule since the assassination of Sadat in 1981. So for that period of time, they were under emergency law the entire time, making it illegal to assemble in groups. And, mass protest was illegal. The government could enact emergency courts anytime they wanted to go after a group of people. On top of that, there were low wages. There was an immense amount of police brutality and torture going on. There was a total lack of free elections, freedom of speech, corruption in the government, and all of this kind of culminated. There were a series of factors, and in my time in Egypt, people were already starting to protest a little bit more, and because protest was illegal, many weren't willing to do it at all, and the police were able to break up the protests pretty easily. The big tipping point, as I saw it living there at the time, was when in June 2010, Khaled Said was killed by the police. He was allegedly in a coffee shop in Alexandria. He was a young man. He had filmed on his phone police being involved in a drug deal. I don't know that was ever confirmed, but that was the story at the time, and there were plenty of people who corroborated that. Police went into the coffee shop, pulled him out, beat him to death in front of a large crowd. His family went to the morgue and took pictures of his body. Those were circulated. A group was formed on Facebook called We Are All Khaled Said, and suddenly I think everyone was forced to confront the reality that they were facing in Egypt and just the level of oppression and the fact that this 23-year-old man who had really been doing nothing wrong was just beaten to death with impunity by the police in front of people in broad daylight on the street. And when that happened, there were massive protests in Alexandria. There were protests in Cairo, and it was the first time that you ever saw the Egyptian people not back down during a protest. They were there to fight for freedom. And the following January is when the revolution happened. January 25th, people took to the streets. The numbers grew to the millions, and they were done. They couldn't do it anymore. I think the emergency law was one of the biggest factors there. Just the level of oppression and lack of freedom was astounding. And even as a foreigner living there, you felt that oppression every day. I had secret police follow me on a regular basis. You never felt truly free to say what you wanted to say. And this is as me not Egyptian. So for the Egyptian people, it's unimaginable, that level of oppression. And I think as the protests happened in Tunisia and the other North African countries, it was just easy for Egypt to follow suit.
And so then you came back to the United States right before the revolution in Egypt had started. What was it like hearing about what was happening?
It was very surreal to watch this all unfold on my street, on the TV, in my very comfortable air-conditioned house. It was so strange because they had these protests on January 25th. There had been, I think, a few self-immolations, people lighting themselves on fire to protest the government. leading up to that day. And I remember that day of protests, I was talking to various friends who were there, who had been out in the square, who said, the mood was really positive. People were excited to be uniting for something. And then the government started issuing threats to turn off cell service and to shut down the internet. So people responded with this plan for a day of anger. And that was January 28th, 2011. I was talking to about 6 friends in Egypt on GChat that day as the people were gathering, and my friends who were Egyptians were going out into the streets, and my friends who were foreigners were barricading themselves in their apartments. I was talking to my friends online, and all of a sudden they just all went offline at once, and the government had turned off the internet. They had turned off all access to the outside world. Some activists were able to access Twitter and Facebook through various means, and that's how the word started getting out that the revolution was happening. Friends who were journalists started being arrested, and I was just sitting in Florida watching it all happen and unfold, and watching the media cover a place that I knew very well that they seemed to know nothing about. And it was a very surreal experience. It was very difficult to watch because I'm watching a TV and I'm watching people I know die in the streets and fight for freedom, while the people covering the event and the media, especially the local correspondents as opposed to the correspondents who were on the ground there, were, very concerned about Egypt's relationship with Israel and where that was going to stand with this. You had President Obama refusing to call Mubarak a dictator. And while I'm sure there were very diplomatic reasons for that, for me to watch people I loved fighting to be free and then watch my government, as well as all the people providing the information to the American people, portrayed in a way where, well, this is now going to be a threat to Israel's security and Mubarak needs to stay in power, and to kind of discredit the people who had gathered to do this momentous thing. I mean, millions of people in Tahrir Square, it was incomprehensible before. I don't think anybody ever thought that could be a reality. And that it was so amazing. And I think as the protests went on, people began to realize how big this was and that it wasn't going away and that these people were desperate. But it was difficult. It was a very difficult time for me personally. It's not about me, but to be watching this unfold from so far away and just to desperately want to be a part of it, or at least be setting the story straight. It was amazing. That the day that Mubarak stepped down was incredible to see, because up until that point he had come on TV several times saying he would step down and then been like, never mind, I'm still going to be the leader of Egypt. I can't do it. So when he finally did, there was just so much hope and celebration, and I think everyone thought that they had done it. In a matter of 2.5, 3 weeks, they had toppled this regime. They had come out on top. Egypt was very united at this time. You had these beautiful images coming out of Egypt with, Christians surrounding the Muslims while they were praying, and women and men fighting together, and all these factions that were often so separated, Coptic Christians and women and men, like all united in this place and not enacting violence against one another, instead of focusing it towards the state. It was just so hopeful. And when they achieved that revolution, when they got Mubarak to step down, it was one of the most beautiful things I've ever witnessed. It was incredible.
Yeah. And you mentioned to me in a conversation we had that your experience being a woman in Egypt before the revolution, and how during the revolution there was this period of unification between men and women. Can you comment on that a little more?
Yeah, Egypt is a wonderful country. I loved living in Egypt, but living in Egypt as a woman was very difficult. The harassment is just so pervasive in every single aspect of your life as a woman, and not just as a foreign woman, but as an Egyptian woman, as a Christian Egyptian woman, as a very conservative Muslim Egyptian woman. It did not matter if you were in shorts or a hijab or in full niqabi. It was a woman on the street was harassed on the street. And that was very difficult. From the moment I would leave my apartment to the moment I got to wherever I was going, I was groped constantly, followed constantly. Groups of young, even little boys would be a part of this. So, I lived right next to a elementary school, young boys, and I would walk past it while they were on their lunch break and I was going to work. I would get chased blocks by just kids grabbing me and chasing after me. And, if I was lucky, some very wonderful Egyptian woman would kind of step in like an Egyptian grandmother and chase them down the street away from me. But it was a difficult reality. As a woman, you very much felt like a lesser citizen every day. And even when I came back to the States, friends would comment on how I just seemed to be so different. I seemed to walk so aggressively and be so tense when I was out of the house. And it's just, that was the impact it has. You're being oppressed by a brutal regime and also by the challenges of being a woman in a country where just men seem to think it's okay to own women they don't even know. Mm-hmm. And that was very difficult.
And then what happened during the mass protesting and when the revolutionary spirit was in the air, so to speak?
And there was just this we are all Egyptians mentality and none of the other stuff matters. And it was so unbelievable to see men and women, so many men and women especially, in a confined quarters just together and working together and saving one another, and people of different classes as well. There was so much unity, and that's the sad thing, was that unity didn't seem to last. Even the night that Mubarak stepped down, that's when Laura Logan, the CBS reporter, was attacked in the square. She was pulled into the crowd. A similar thing happened to me at a protest after I went back. And the unity just seemed to break down a little bit.
So after the revolution, you traveled back to Egypt. From your experience, did you notice any changes from the last time you were there? What was happening at that time?
It was different in so many ways. For one, foreigners were not going to Egypt at this point. So in some ways, when I arrived, it was a lot of excitement that an American girl was even there. And on the streets, there seemed to be a mixture of, oh, yay, a tourist, but also, oh, but you're American. And you have to understand that the Egyptian protesters were getting shot by American-made bullets. They were getting, the tear gas cans had made in the USA stamped on them. So there was a lot of anti-American sentiment as well. And that was one of the first major things that I noticed and just wasn't quite prepared for, perhaps naively, knowing that the U.S. government did fund the military and was the one who provided a lot of the weapons that were used against protesters. And then on top of that, there seemed to be, Egypt always felt like a very safe place. There wasn't a very high crime rate. I could walk alone at 1 a.m. in Egypt and be totally fine. That was no longer the case after the revolution. There was more petty crime. There were more pickpockets happening. As a woman in Egypt, the one refuge was always the woman's metro car, and men always respected, for the most part, that was the woman's space. And so you could get on the metro and be in the woman's car. And
there's a separate car for women?
Yeah. And it's not required to use it. You can. There's also the co-ed car, but if you're a woman, you want to be on. It's less crowded, first of all, and then also no harassment. Men started coming onto the women's car all the time. And that was like a small thing, but that totally took away some of the freedoms you had as a woman in Egypt. Like the one place you had to go was gone. And on top of that, I lived in an apartment right across the street from the Ministry of the Interior. So it was different. I was used to police being there all the time. It was different to have military tanks on every street and just a constant heavy military presence. There were curfews. I think you expected it to feel more free, and really emergency law was still in place. Mm-hmm. Now Mubarak's right-hand man was in charge of things, Suleiman, while they were waiting to hold elections. And it was just a different kind of oppression, really. Journalists were now being arrested regularly. Egyptian activists were being arrested. all the time. And they were before, but now it was like known that they were being arrested. It wasn't kept a secret. There was a lot of police brutality was still happening, military brutality really at this point. So
this was the counter-revolution when the military took power. Mm-hmm. What do you think allowed for that to happen? I know we've talked about it. What do you think it was?
Overall, the Egyptian people had a great deal of respect for the military. And I think there were very much the educated factions of the revolutionaries who understood that when the military rolled in the middle of the revolution, in the middle of the initial protests, that wasn't necessarily a good thing. But I think most Egyptian people at first felt like the military was there to protect them. I remember reading on Twitter, during the first few days of the protesting, the military is here now. They're here to protect us, and there would be the other tweets that said, the military surrounded us in the square, and we don't know what they're going to do. But there seemed to be this idea that the military would keep them safe. Everyone in Egypt, all men are required to serve in the military. There's a lot of respect for it. I think it was seen as a bit separate from Mubarak's regime, and maybe that fed into this kind of trust where the police were the problem, and the regime was the problem, but the military is not the police. The military are this separate thing. And that's just my observation and my experience. And I think the trust in the military, in addition to the fact that then when they had their elections, Morsi, a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, was elected, and a lot of the revolutionary youth weren't okay with that. They weren't okay with having a religious group in power. He had technically, I think, disavowed them. He had to take the position, but not much he can disavow. And he was also arresting people. He was ordering executions. He was by no means perfect, and there was enough discontent with him and still just enough trust in the military to rise up against Morsi. And then ultimately the military, with the backing of the people, or enough of the people, was able to stage a coup. And Morsi was arrested. Originally, Tantawi came to power. He was the head of the armed forces. And then elections were held, and now we have the defense minister, al-Sisi, as the leader of Egypt. So
we have been listening to Brittany Victoria Gonzalez. Thank you so much for joining us, Brittany.
You're welcome.
If you want to learn more about the show, give us feedback, or share ideas on topics or speakers, you can find us on Facebook. Just search Let's Talk About the Middle East. If you leave an interesting comment, we'll give you a shout out on our next show. You can find this interview and others on our YouTube channel.